Can vitamin D become toxic? Let's find out. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ask Dr. Pickel show. All right, so today we are going to talk about vitamin D and potential for toxicity. You hear all these great and wonderful things about vitamin D, but can it be a problem? Can it actually cause issues and create some trouble? So let's dive right in with this. All right. Let's go here. Okay, so vitamin D, of course, known as an important immune system regulator. I mean, you hear about it with bone health and actually quite a few other things for vitamin D. It's very important, but it is probably the most important and the most studied as it relates to your immune system. Now, also, we have to understand that vitamin D isn't a vitamin. It's a steroid. It's a hormone. We actually need this hormone. Pretty darn important. In fact, if you don't get vitamin D, you can actually get you can get a few different conditions, but especially what's called rickets. We won't go into that. And then also, where can we get vitamin D? From the sunshine. We can get it from foods and vitamin supplements. And then, of course, if you get your blood tested, they're going to check the inactive form D25OH most commonly. And that's where usually a lot of people set like around a 50 or 60. Maybe people with chronic health conditions, chronic autoimmune issues, you may be looking at maybe like a 70 to 100, but that's the one that usually gets tested. Rarely do you get the D125OH tested, which is the active form, the one that actually does the job in the body. And that one, the range can range from about 20 to 80. We'll talk about why that's important here in a second. So vitamin D, number one, we can take it, but eventually it has to get to our cells to do the job. And not only just regular, when we think of maybe the immune system and immune system cells, but no, I mean, this stuff is important in a lot of different cells. Look at all this. I mean, there's vitamin D receptor sites. The vitamin D receptor sites are like little gates on the cells for vitamin D. Our cells have little doorways, gates, what I would call parking spaces for vitamin D. And it's very important that those are working. So VDR, that's the vitamin D receptor site on the cell. Let's say the cells are out here. And then calcitriol, that's that D125OH. That's the active form of vitamin D that actually docks or parks in the parking space. And again, it does that on all of these different cells. So here's how all this really works. We can get the sunshine, we can eat the food, we can take the supplements to supply vitamin D, and it may be D3, it could be D2 also. But what happens is all the supplements, the food, the sunshine, that has to go through the liver first. The liver takes that vitamin D, well, let's say D3 in this case, and converts it into this 25OH vitamin D. That's the form that the body can actually use. So, we can take it, but the liver has to be transforming it first. Then this form, this is the one that's commonly measured on the blood test that your doctor will say, hey, yeah, you're like a 50 or 60 on here, or maybe an 80, or maybe you're only at a 15, which would not be good. That's what they're measuring right here. So that has to go to the kidneys. That really doesn't do anything. That's inactive. It tells us, though, how much is in your system to be converted. So then it goes to the kidneys, and the kidneys do a lot of things. They don't just deliver urine out of the body. They actually do quite a few different jobs. And one of their jobs is to turn this 25OH vitamin D into the active form, D125. That's called calcitriol. That's the form. That's the one that does all the action. That is actually kind of a little gem here. Calcitriol is probably the most potent hormone in the entire body. Pretty interesting. But this calcitriol then has to get in a taxi cab called a vitamin D receptor protein or binding protein, vitamin D binding protein, and then it travels to these receptors. So these little blue things here, these are the receptors. These are the doorways on the cell. Let's call them the parking spaces on the cell, because then once it gets there, then it can be delivered. It can be brought into the cell and delivered to the nucleus of the cell. And that's where your DNA and RNA are. And that's where actually the vitamin D finally goes to work and helps those have what's called transcription, kind of does the job that it was supposed to do. So here's the problem. Now, rarely do you overdose on food or sunshine. I mean, if you do, it usually doesn't affect your vitamin D excessively. It's mainly supplementation. If you're taking vitamin D and taking pretty good amounts, that still goes in, it still goes to the liver, still goes here. Now, this will raise up. Let's say you were at like 40. Now you're taking all this vitamin D, and now you're like at 60, 70, 80, 90, maybe you're over 100. Maybe now you're like at 130 on your blood. And then that's going to cause this to raise up too. Now the active forms up. Now, if both of these are elevated, what's going to happen is now we've got all this vitamin D at in the parking space. We've got these parking spaces here, these receptors, these binding receptors, VDR, vitamin D receptors, and we're just taking tons of vitamin D, and so these receptors start to get all kinds of vitamin D parking outside the receptor. So what do you think the human body does? Because this is not a vitamin, it's a hormone. And whenever you have an excess amount of hormone in the body, that shuts down the receptor sites. Excess hormone causes the garage doors to now lock and close. So now vitamin D can't get in, or otherwise you could oversaturate the cell, which could damage the cell, which is not good news. So it closes all that down. Now the inside of the cell is like, hey guys, I'm out of vitamin D. I need some vitamin D. And then outside the cell, the vitamin D parking attendants, we can just say, are like, hey, wait, there's too much out here. If we open those doors, it's going to flood in, create all kinds of damage. We got to keep those doors closed. So then the person's like, well, wait a second. I'm starting to get sick. I've got a cold. I'm feeling yucky. I need some vitamins. I got these symptoms of low vitamin D. So then they might take some more. Well, what happens is if you flood the system and start to add, let's add more supplement in. Yeah, it'll go through the pathway. It will add more here. Now we have an excessive amount. We're even adding more in there. Now, if you add enough extra in there, you will sneak some through the door. You will get past the parking attendants. You will oversaturate to the point you will get some into the cell. So that may make you feel better temporarily, but then it's going to go back down again. The doors are going to shut tighter and lock, and then there's more restrictions. Hey, we're not letting in any vitamin D, even if you're saturated this much. So then that's a problem, because now if you're like, okay, I'm going to go get my vitamin D checked because I'm getting sick all the time and all these things are happening. So then you go and they check your vitamin D and it's like through the roof, and you're like, hey, your vitamin D is at 150. You need to stop taking your vitamin D. So you stop. But just because you stop today doesn't mean you get to start taking it tomorrow, because these receptors will shut down and stay shut down until your body says the coast is clear, for maybe days, maybe weeks. It may take a while for those receptors to reset and allow vitamin D in again. In the meantime, vitamin D is on the basement floor, or there's really almost none to help these cells out. So then they cannot perform or do what they're supposed to do, especially not good for your immune system function and many other functions like bone health. So now you've created this whole toxic picture here of problem just by overdosing on vitamin D, which is not a good thing. All right, so too much vitamin D causes receptor shutdown. Those garage doors close, they lock, don't let any more in. We do not want receptor shutdown for vitamin D or any other hormone. This could happen the same way with female hormones. Blood tests. So yeah, if you are taking vitamin D, you should get tested. Not only your regular D25, which is tested commonly to kind of see where that's at, that inactive form, but if it's a persistent issue, or you have an autoimmune condition, or you take a ton of vitamin D, then you may want to get that active form tested to just see where it's at, to see if it's high enough. Now, some people, even though they have a good level of vitamin D or high, this can sometimes be low. Now, we're not going to talk about that today. There's another reason for that. Or sometimes this can still be high when this is low. So we'll talk about those on maybe a separate video. Now, the thing is, though, is this means you can have the signs and symptoms of low vitamin D, even though you got way too much in your system because none is getting into your cells. So then your cells don't work properly, and then you get symptoms and problems. So I would say pretty much anybody who's taking over 5,000 international units of vitamin D, you should get your blood tested to make sure that those levels are correct, that you're not oversaturating and creating this toxic scenario. It's not the more the better. Now, again, some of these levels, I mean, there's actually a great authority that says, hey, it's not really a problem if this D25 even gets up to 200. That can be okay in certain scenarios with certain types of conditions, like autoimmune type conditions or chronic immuno issues there. So, but we also need to look at this and make sure you're not oversaturating. So, all right. Well, hopefully everybody enjoyed this. Got some great information on vitamin D toxicity. God bless, and I will see you on the next video.